are, of course, independent of the United Kingdom. They make their own decisions, they draw up their own laws, which are ruled on by their own courts. But that is not the end of the story. Their constitutions have been drawn up in consultation with Her Majesty's government here. Their governors are appointed by Her Majesty's government. External affairs, defence, internal security and policing remain the responsibility of the governor acting on behalf of Her Majesty's government, and the UK government does often step in. Sometimes that is with financial and military support, as has happened recently in the Caribbean following the terrible hurricane season. At other times, the UK government takes a different line on a matter of important policy, as, for instance, when I, as Minister, had to suspend the government in Turks and Caicos because of corruption, or when David Cameron pushed the overseas territories to implement public registers of preferential ownership so as to end some of the secrecy that attends the financial provisions in those territories and have brought sometimes the British financial system into disrepute. This is as true for Bermuda as it is for any of the others overseas territories. And I honestly have no desire to upset this delicate balance, although it is my firm belief that British citizens should enjoy the same freedoms in Bermuda as in England or in Wales, or for that matter in Northern Ireland. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Bermuda has made some significant strides in recent years on LGBT rights. Immigration law has been changed to allow immigration rights for non-Bermudian same-sex partners of Bermudians. Gays and lesbians, either by themselves or as a couple, are now able to adopt, and anti-discrimination legislation includes protection on the basis of sexual orientation. And another positive step came last year when, on the 5th of May, the Supreme Court in Bermuda ruled in a case brought by Winston Godwin and his Canadian fiancée, Greg de Roche, that the applicants, and I quote, were discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation when the registrar refused to process their notice of intended marriage. The applicants are entitled to an order of mandamus compelling the registrar to act in accordance with the requirements of the Marriage Act and a declaration that same-sex couples are entitled to be married under the Marriage Act. It was clear that the then government was not very happy with the ruling. It had indeed held a very poorly attended referendum on the matter the year before, actually on the 23rd of June 2016, quite a date for referendums. A referendum, incidentally, which no lesbian or gay organisation or individual had ever called for, but which the government insisted on. And that suggested, on a less than 50% turnout, that Bermudians opposed both same-sex marriage and same-sex civil unions by roughly 2 to 1. Which was why Justice Charles Etta Simmons made it clear in her summation that the politicians failed, the referendum failed, so I will step in and protect the rights of a minority. Many people in Bermuda and in many other overseas territories and countries around the world rejoiced at that moment. There were two sensible, non-confrontational courses the Bermudian government could then have taken. It could have decided to abide by the ruling of the court, or it could have appealed to the Privy Council in this country. That is the standard process for appealing a decision. In fact, the Minister of Home Affairs then announced on the 9th of May that they would not appeal to the Privy Council, and on the 31st of May, the first same-sex marriage took place in Bermuda. There have now been 8 such marriages in total and 4 further publications of bans of marriage. Then came a new government after an election which decided to draft a law which will abolish same-sex marriage and replace it with domestic partnerships, albeit allowing those same-sex marriages which had already been celebrated to stand in a rather limbo position. It is, I have to say, a deeply unpleasant and very cynical piece of legislation. It sounds quite nice on the face of it, as if it's just the same as civil partnerships in this country, but it's not. It seeks to keep marriage officers separate from domestic partnership officers, as if to protect them from some kind of infection. It allows a domestic partnership to be voided on the sole grounds of venereal disease. It was introduced by a government whose members have openly declared that they are opposed to civil unions of any kind whatsoever, and pretended not even to know that same-sex couples have regularly been denied the right to make important medical decisions on behalf of their sick and dying partners in Bermuda. It includes in Section 53 which states, notwithstanding, I'm quoting, notwithstanding anything in the Human Rights Act 1981, any other provision of law, or the judgment of the Supreme Court in Godwin and de Roche versus the Registrar General d'Others, delivered on the 5th of May 2017, a marriage is void unless the parties are respectively male and female. In all honesty, in all the history of legislation, I have never seen a piece of legislation that so clearly declares from the outset that it is inconsistent with all the other laws in the land, including the Human Rights Act and the Constitution and the judgment of the Supreme Court. It is almost begging the Supreme Court to come to exactly the same decision as it did last year. Unfortunately, however, this bill was agreed by both houses in Bermuda on the 8th of December. But it cannot, of course, become law unless and until the United Kingdom appointed governor, John Rankin, signifies royal assent on behalf of the government, which so far he has not done. I believe he is entirely within his rights both to delay a final decision or, if he chooses, to refuse royal assent, as the Bermudian constitution states at section 35 that unless he has been authorised by a Secretary of State to assent thereto, the governor shall reserve for the signification of Her Majesty's pleasure any bill which appears to him, acting in his discretion, to be inconsistent with any obligation of Her Majesty or of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom towards any other state or power or any international organisation, to be likely to prejudice the royal prerogative, to be in any way repugnant to or inconsistent with the provisions of this Constitution, to affect any matter for which he is responsible under Section 62 of the Constitution, or to relate to currency or banking. I think that in at least two of those limbs of that section, the governor has very good cause not to grant royal assent. Since Section 12 of the Constitution expressly guarantees freedom from discrimination, and the Bermudian Human Rights Act of 1981 also expressly prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation in at least 7 different points, it is difficult to disagree with the Supreme Court of Bermuda, and therefore equally difficult to see how the governor could agree royal assent. There are other reasons why the governor should withhold assent, I believe. It would have been one thing if the Bermudian government had introduced civil partnerships as a forward step when there was no such provision in law in Bermuda, but this is now a retrograde step. It's taking a step backwards, deliberately limiting the rights presently enjoyed by many Bermudians. This, incidentally, is not just a matter of marriages contracted in Bermuda. The law also applies to Bermuda-registered ships, including many cruise liners which used to be registered out of the United Kingdom. So the service of marriage at sea, which Cunard and P&O offer, for instance, on the Queen Mary II, the Queen Victoria and the Queen Elizabeth, there's some irony in this, is presently available to same-sex couples. I understand that there was a great big party on one of the P&O liners when the Supreme Court decision was announced. Considerable amounts of champagne were drunk, and there have since been 3 on-board marriages on P&O cruise liners. If the proposed law goes ahead, however, these marriages will cease, and Cunard believe that it is likely that Bermudian law will not permit a same-sex wedding ceremony on board their ships after the end of this month. They say, we are very unhappy about this decision and we do not underestimate the disappointment this will cause those guests who have planned their weddings. I'm certain that those people will be taking new cases to the Supreme Court in Bermuda. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have had a great number of emails, tweets and messages about this, and some of them have been quite pleasant. Some of the others have not. Some have told me in very robust terms to butt out. It should just be up to Bermuda, they say. But I disagree. This impinges on how Britain is viewed around the world, and I take just as active an interest in the human rights of LGBT people in Moscow, in Tehran and in Beijing as in Hamilton. Because the thing is, human rights are, to use a biblical phrase, a seamless garment. You can't divide them up. As one Bermudian put it in an email to me, all people have the right to be equal under the law and the right to exercise their full range of human rights without exception. This is how I live my life, and this is what I encourage others around me to do. Black and white, man and woman, gay and straight, Russian, Iranian, American, Canadian, Bermudian. It's all the same. It's exactly the same. We are all human beings and the human rights should not differ. And to the person who told me not to interfere because we haven't sorted out Northern Ireland yet, I would add that when we had a Labour government and we legislated in England and Wales in favour of LGBT rights, we decided that we were going to advance that legislation in Northern Ireland as well, even when Northern Irish politicians objected. I believe that this government here in Westminster needs to look hard at Northern Ireland and implement equality. It is unfair that our Northern Irish brothers and sisters are unable to enjoy the same rights as everybody else. Mr. Deputy Speaker, some people say you change hearts and minds first and then you change the law. I profoundly disagree with that. There is clear evidence that changing the law helps change people's hearts and minds. For 2 centuries and more, people, including people who considered themselves to be good, upstanding Christians, considered that slavery was just a part of the natural order. It was laid down, it was allowed, and indeed many bishops had large plantations with many slaves. We now know that that was a cruel and despotic belief. We find it unthinkable that people could conceive of slavery as acceptable today. It is my profound belief that in 100 years' time, people will wonder what on earth people were thinking when they condemned homosexuality as a sin, when they barred gay and lesbian couples from declaring their love for one another in marriage, when they fought tooth and nail to say marriage had to be exclusively between a man and a woman. Because really, what harm does it do to anyone else if 2 men are allowed to marry? Has the sky fallen in Bermuda? Have straight husbands suddenly abandoned their wives, or heterosexual wives run off with each other? Have straight marriages lost their sparkle? Of course they haven't. If anything, straight couples should be rejoicing that so many people now want to form long-lasting, stable relationships and to get married. Because marriage is a thing of beauty. The public declaration of love between 2 people, from this day forward, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, it binds people and families together. It gives a safe home to thousands of children and to elderly parents as well. It enriches life, it gives hope, and often it banishes loneliness, the loneliness that for generations and generations gay men and lesbian women thought would be their lot. And for many gay men and lesbian couples too, same-sex marriage provides a public affirmation that chases away the ghosts of shame and self-loathing that so many grew up with thanks to the hateful judgmentalism of others. So why on earth would anyone want to deny that to anyone else? Why on earth would a Christian want to deny that to anyone else? Why on earth would we perpetuate the homophobia that has left youngsters emotionally bruised by hateful taunts in the playground or physically battered almost to death outside gay bars because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? Now, of course, I'd much prefer it if the governor did not sign the Domestic Partnerships Bill into law, did not grant assent. I hope he doesn't. I hope the Foreign Secretary does not instruct him to do so either. If necessary, I hope he just lets it lie on the table until the Supreme Court has another go, which it almost certainly will. But what would be even better, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I'm honest, is if the Bermudian government thought again, respected all their fellow citizens, embraced the principle that the first rule of equality is to protect minorities, and withdrew the Domestic Partnership Bill itself. And I say to the Minister for Home Affairs in Bermuda, the Honourable Walton Brown, if you withdraw the bill, it will one day be the single action in your political career that you will be most proud of. One day it will be, and your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will say, that's what he did. And to the Premier, the Honourable David Burt, I would add, you are a very clever man. You graduated cum laude from George Washington University and you've led the Progressive Labour Party very successfully to power in the elections last year. You have said publicly that homosexuality is not a lifestyle choice and that this is not really about your religious beliefs. And yet you hold that same-sex marriage is just not culturally acceptable. Those are your words. I'm sorry, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but that is just cruel. If it is an innate part of some people's personality, some would say God created them that way, then it is simply cruel to deny that opportunity that everybody else would want for themselves. It isn't rational, it isn't progressive, it is just naked prejudice. And the Labour Party that I'm a member of has always supported LGBT rights, even in the dark days of the Victorians, the Edwardians, the Georgians, right up to legislating to get rid of the horrible legislation in the 1960s. So I say to Bermuda and to the Premier of Bermuda, I hope you change your mind. I hope Bermuda changes its mind, and I hope the government doesn't sign this legislation into law.
Duncan. Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I start by personally welcoming you back to the chair after a difficult period over Christmas, and we offer the congratulations of the House on your knighthood. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Rhondda for securing this debate, and I appreciate that the Honourable Gentleman raised this in business questions on the 11th of January, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss this issue now at greater length. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights makes clear that human rights and freedoms are interrelated, interdependent and indivisible. They are the guarantors of freedom, of non-discrimination and the innate dignity of every human being, and they apply equally to all of humankind. When lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people demand their rights, they're not asking for anything unique to them. They're simply asking to be accorded the same rights, the dignity and the respect which really should be given to everybody as a citizen in the world. And this government is committed to promoting and protecting the rights of LGBT people, not only because it's the right and just thing to do, but also because we believe that the strongest, safest and most prosperous societies are those that are the most open and inclusive. They are societies in which all citizens can live freely without fear of discrimination and can play a full and active part in national life. And last year marked 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales. And since then, the Honourable Gentleman and I have shared and championed this cause over many years, from the equalisation of the age of consent through to the introduction of civil partnerships, from which I would add that both of us have benefited, to the introduction of the Gender Recognition Act and the recognition here, at least, of gay marriage. In our lifetimes, and indeed in our parliamentary lifetime, attitudes towards homosexuality have been transformed. Barriers to opportunity have been broken down, and this country now has one of the strongest legislative frameworks in the world for preventing and tackling discrimination. So this government, as the one that preceded us, is committed to promoting LGBT equality globally through projects, partnerships and persuasion. And today we're spending over £1.5 million over 3 years through the Magna Carta Fund to promote and protect the rights of LGBT people where they are under threat. So we're working with like-minded countries to promote our expertise through international organisations and through bodies like the Equal Rights Coalition. And where we find discrimination, we work publicly and privately with governments and civil society to change attitudes and improve legal protection. However, it's important to recognise that even in our own society, the transformation in attitudes did not happen overnight. Indeed, our own Same-Sex Couples Act only passed into law 4 years ago. Now, this knowledge influences how we handle the progress in other countries. It is not reasonable to expect or demand sudden change in other countries when it took so long to happen in our own. We must also recognise that this kind of change of attitude cannot be imposed from the outside. It must emerge from within as old prejudices are exposed and are argued against and are then set aside. Now, we can, of course, help to encourage change, but in doing so, we must be aware of the local situation and be respectful of individual democracies. And this is also the case in relation to our overseas territories. The British overseas territories are separate, self-governing jurisdictions with their own democratically elected representatives. Now, I'm pleased, as I'm sure is the Honourable Gentleman, that the British Antarctic Territory, the British Indian Ocean Territory, the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, the Pitcairn Islands, St. Helena, Ascension, Tristan da Cunha, and South Georgia and the Sandwich Islands have all taken steps to recognise and legally authorise same-sex marriage. In places where that progress has not been mirrored, we believe our best approach is to encourage, persuade, and if necessary, cajole, through engagement with both governments and civil society. Our relationships with the territories are best served if they're based on partnership and consensus. So that's why this government has no plans to impose same-sex marriage in the overseas territories. However, ministers have been very clear with overseas territory governments that they must respect applicable international obligations. In Bermuda, public opinion on same-sex marriage and civil unions is split. Bermuda's non-binding referendum in 2016 on this very issue failed to attract the 50% turnout required by legislation to answer the question definitively. The majority of those who did respond were actually opposed to both same-sex marriage and civil unions. 69% opposed same-sex marriage and 63% opposed civil unions. In May last year, the Bermuda Supreme Court found that the established definition of marriage as only being between a man and a woman was inconsistent with Bermuda's Human Rights Act. The court therefore declared that same-sex couples should also be entitled to be married. As a result, the first same-sex marriage in Bermuda took place that same month. Following Bermuda's election last year, the governing party introduced the Domestic Partnership Bill. This would withdraw the entitlement for same-sex couples to marry and replace it with a provision for domestic partnerships for all couples, regardless of gender. And the intent of the bill is to provide those who are described as, in their law, domestic partners, with the same benefits as married couples, including provision for pensions, inheritance, healthcare, tax and immigration. Now, we're obviously disappointed about the removal of same-sex marriage rights, but any intervention in the legislative process in any British overseas territory without their consent would be an exceptional step, and therefore the Secretary of State is considering the implications of this bill very carefully. But there are three important points that I would urge the House and the honourable member moving the debate tonight to bear in mind. The first is that if the bill receives assent, it does ensure that Bermudians who have been legally married in Bermuda since the Supreme Court decision will retain their married status, and they will enjoy the same legal rights as those in domestic partnerships, putting this on a clear statutory footing, of course.
I am aware of that fact, and indeed I referred to it in my own comments. But the problem is, just imagine if you lived in a society where you were at one point allowed to be same-sex married, and then your marriage is allowed to stand, but nobody else in your society is allowed to. That is a pretty effective way of demeaning that relationship and that marriage contract. I think I see why they've done it, but I don't think it's a saving grace.
But I think there's no doubt in the honourable gentleman's argument that it does create a a slightly unusual anomaly for what I understand to be 8 couples. So in that sense, he has a point. In terms of whether or not it's demeaning depends on how one regards the alternative that is being offered. And so I move to my second point, which is that the European Court of Human Rights has consistently held that there is not yet a right to same-sex marriage, but there is a requirement to provide some legal recognition of same-sex relationships. And the final point worth bearing in mind is that less than a year ago, same-sex couples had no legal recognition at all under Bermudian law. Now they have the equivalent of recognition through civil partnership if this bill goes through. And while I not wish to do anything but express regret over the backward step from the Supreme Court ruling, we should acknowledge that this domestic partnership bill does represent progress in comparison to the situation just a year ago, and does extend, albeit a step short of marriage, equal rights and recognition to a legal partnership between same-sex couples.
Yeah, will the Minister not accept that the UK itself is open to international judgment as a result of the policies of its overseas territories, and that given that Britain has a governor in Bermuda and retains responsibility to ensure good government, we should use our powers and influence to secure human rights, and human rights involve equal treatment indeed for LGBT people as well as everyone else?
I do not accept the Honourable Gentleman's interpretation of our liability in this sense, in the sense that he's expressed. And as I've just explained, the human rights legislation, as we understand it, does not explain, as he would have it, the right to recognition in quite the terms that he suggests. So there will be, if the law goes through, civil partnership, which is what we had just a few years ago. And it is a law which extends rights which the mere recognition of marriage did not extend in terms of pensions, inheritance, tax, and such other equalities. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this government is giving careful consideration to Bermuda's domestic partnership bill in order to assess its implications in relation to our collective international obligations and our constitutional relationship with Bermuda. I will update the House when the government has had time to finalise its position on that.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend just before he finishes. What is his assessment of the likelihood that the Supreme Court in Bermuda will revisit this position, particularly because quite clearly, as he has himself suggested, a very anomalous position is being created between the rights of some gay couples who have got married under the existing provision and those that will not be allowed to do so in future? And was it not the case that the Supreme Court itself said that this historic and insular perspective on marriage was, and I quote, out of step with the reality of Bermuda in the 21st century?
I'm not in a position, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to know what the Supreme Court is likely to be asked to do or will do. All we know at the moment is what lies on the table in terms of the passage of this particular bill. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will end by reiterating this government's absolute commitment to promoting equal rights and fighting discrimination across the globe. We're fully committed to striving for a safer, fairer, more tolerant world where everyone has the opportunity to achieve their potential and live the life they choose.
The question is this House to now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.